If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I've prepared especially for you. The last light of the day stretched across the empty road when the stagecoach finally gave way. Its rear axle cracked on a stone, wheels buckled, and the wagon tipped sideways until it stopped in a shallow wash. One horse already dead from the gunfire of raiders, and the others gone in a panic. The driver slumped against the wheel, his shirt dark with blood, breath long gone. A woman in her late 20s sat half in the dirt, her traveling dress torn to the knee, one hand pressed hard against her thigh where blood seeped between her fingers. She was Lady Catherine, daughter of a wealthy Eastern family. Her father had arranged her passage west to marry into land and influence. To her family, it was a practical deal. To her, it was a sentence. She had boarded the coach with a small trunk, resentment heavy in her chest, telling herself that whatever waited out here could not be worse than the cold halls of the house she had grown up in. Now, in the middle of nowhere, with her leg burning and dust in her teeth, she found herself alone, angry, and frightened in equal measure. Her eyes scanned the road. No riders, no sign of the men who had attacked, no sound but the faint rattle of insects. She told herself she would not panic. Noblewomen did not break down in public. But this was not a ballroom. This was a stretch of wilderness where her name meant nothing. She tightened her jaw and waited for whatever came next. It was near dusk when a lone rider appeared, moving slow across the open ground. He wore dust-worn clothes, a hat pulled low, a rifle tied across his saddle. His name was Daniel, though he rarely gave it to strangers. He had once been a rancher, then a husband, then a father. Disease had taken both wife and child in one hard winter, and afterward he had drifted, working cattle, guarding freight, always on the move, speaking little. He carried himself with the look of a man who had stopped expecting much, yet who still answered when someone needed help. Daniel saw the wreck from a distance and slowed his horse. He noticed the broken wheel, the scattered trunks, the still body of the driver. He counted the tracks in the dirt, saw where riders had circled and then left, and his eyes rested on the woman sitting stiffly in the dust. She looked up, posture proud despite the torn dress, eyes flashing with suspicion as he dismounted. He walked toward her without hurry, boots crunching gravel. His first thought was practical. She was bleeding bad, and the wound needed cleaning before fever set in. He crouched near her, pulled a canteen from his belt, and reached for her leg. "Don't touch me," she snapped, her voice sharp but unsteady. Her accent was crisp, the kind that marked her upbringing, and her expression carried more anger than fear. She recoiled, as if his hand were an insult. Daniel stopped, studying her. He saw the pride in her posture, the refusal to admit weakness. He also saw the pale skin around her lips, the way her hand shook as she pressed down on the wound. He weighed his options in silence. If he left her, she would not last through the night. If he insisted, she might fight him and waste precious time. "I'm not asking," he said quietly, his voice steady low. "You'll die if it festers." Her chest rose with a hard breath. She wanted to argue, to tell him she didn't need him, but the pain pulsed through her thigh like a hammer. She looked at his face, lined, calm, and unflinching. Not cruel, not eager, just certain. That certainty cut through her pride. He pulled out a knife, cut the fabric around her wound, and rinsed it with the last of his water. She clenched her teeth and bit down on a leather strap from the trunk to keep from crying out. His hands were steady, practical, no more personal than a blacksmith's shaping iron. He tore a strip from his undershirt, wrapped the thigh, and tied it firm. When it was done, she let the strap fall from her mouth and leaned back, breathing hard. She wanted to say something sharp, something to remind him of who she was. But her voice failed her. Daniel didn't press. He lifted her carefully, set her across his saddle. She stiffened, trying to pull away, but there was nowhere to go. He mounted, guiding the horse toward the mountains where he knew an old line shack stood. She sat rigid in front of him, clutching the saddle horn, her mind torn between fury at her position and the realization that this stranger had, for the moment, become her only chance at survival. Behind them, the stagecoach leaned broken against the wheel, dust already settling over the wreck. Ahead lay miles of wilderness, a one-room cabin, and days of forced silence neither of them had asked for. The trail into the hills grew darker as the last light sank behind the ridges. Daniel kept the horse at a steady walk, careful not to jar her wound, though every step still sent a sharp tremor through her body. Catherine tried to hold herself upright, chin high, shoulders stiff, but the ache in her thigh forced her to lean back against him. She hated the closeness, hated the smell of sweat and dust on his shirt, hated most of all that she needed him. Yet beneath the anger was fear. Fear of infection, fear of another attack, fear that this stranger might not be what he seemed. She wondered why he had stopped at all. Was it pity, duty, or did he expect something in return? Daniel's thoughts were simpler. He had seen too many wounded left behind, and he would not add her to that number. Still, he knew enough to recognize she was no ordinary traveler. Her dress, though torn, had been fine cloth. Her speech was sharp, the kind learned in parlors and schools, not on the trail. She carried herself with entitlement even now. But behind it, he sensed a woman who had not been given choices, only orders. He did not ask her story yet. Questions could wait until the wound was safe. By the time they reached the lined shack, the night air was sharp with pine. The cabin was small, made of weathered logs, a single room with a stove, a bunk, and shelves holding jars and tins. Daniel dismounted first, then lifted her carefully from the saddle. She hissed at the movement, gripping his shoulder tighter than she meant to, then pushed away as soon as her feet touched the ground. Her leg nearly gave out, and he caught her before she fell. The brief contact sent heat into her face, half shame, half anger. Inside, he set her on the bunk and struck a match to light the lamp. The glow revealed more than she wished. Dust on her cheeks, the stiff angle of her jaw, the pale skin around her wound. She tried to compose herself, brushing dirt from her dress, but the sight of blood through the cloth betrayed her condition. He fetched water from a barrel outside, boiled it on the stove, and laid out what little he had: clean rags, soap, a small jar of honey, a sewing needle. When he approached, she pulled back again. "You've done enough," she said. Her voice was brittle, carrying the weight of pride. Yet he saw the way her fingers trembled as she tried to hold the fabric closed. "You'll lose the leg if it festers," he said, flat and certain. He waited. After a tense silence, she let out a short breath and shifted, allowing him access. He cleaned the wound with practiced care. She bit down on her sleeve, eyes burning, refusing to cry out. Each touch of cold water sent waves of pain through her, and she hated the helplessness, hated that he saw her like this. But she also noticed the steadiness of his hands, the way he worked without hesitation, without cruelty. He had done this before, she realized, too many times. When he finished binding the leg, he moved to the stove and opened a tin of beans. The smell filled the room, plain but grounding. He slid a plate across the table and stepped back. Catherine hesitated, then ate, each bite slow, her eyes flicking toward him as if to gauge his intentions. He sat on the floor by the door, back against the wall, rifle within reach. The silence pressed between them until she broke it. "You knew where to find this place. Why were you riding alone?" He kept his eyes on the stove. "Cabin belongs to the ranch I worked. I keep in shape, easier than sleeping under the sky." It wasn't the whole truth, but it was enough. She studied him, a man hardened by years, careful with words, carrying a sorrow he did not speak. She thought of the raiders, of how easily they had taken the coach, of how quickly death had come to the driver. If this man had wanted her dead, he would not have wasted time saving her. The thought unsettled her more than comforted her. When she finished eating, she asked another question, this one sharper, born of suspicion. "Why did you stop? You could have kept riding." Daniel's jaw tightened. He looked at her then, eyes steady, voice quiet. "Because I don't leave people for the coyotes." She held his gaze, searching for something more, some hidden motive. But there was nothing in his tone but truth. She turned away, unsettled by how easily he cut through her doubts. Later, when the wind rose outside, rattling the loose boards, she asked where he would sleep. He laid his blanket on the floor near the door. "Here." Safer that way. The answer relieved her, though she would not admit it. She turned toward the wall, closing her eyes. But as exhaustion pulled her under, she thought of her father, of the fiancé waiting in some distant ranch house. And for the first time since leaving the East, she felt the full weight of how far from home she was. Daniel lay awake longer. He thought of the grave he had left behind, the silence that had followed him since. He did not know what trouble this woman carried, but he knew one thing clearly. For now, her survival rested on him. And though he had not sought it, that was a duty he would not abandon. The first gray light of morning pushed through the cracks in the cabin walls, and Catherine opened her eyes to the sound of movement. For a moment, disoriented, she thought she was back in her father's house, a servant setting kindling to the fireplace. Then she remembered the broken stagecoach, the pain in her thigh, the man on the floor with his rifle. She sat up slowly, stiff from the hard bunk, and watched Daniel move about the room. He had already lit the stove, water boiling, the smell of coffee drifting through the air. Her leg throbbed, the bandage damp with blood. She dreaded the moment he would check it again. Pride told her to resist, but practicality whispered that her life depended on his skill. She hated being caught between those two forces. Daniel glanced at her, a brief look, then returned to his work. He poured coffee into a tin cup, set it on the table, and slid it toward her without comment. She hesitated, then reached for it. The cup was warm, the taste bitter, but it steadied her. She noticed how he moved, efficient, direct, never wasting energy. There was no performance, no attempt to impress her, only the plain rhythm of a man used to survival. When he knelt to change the bandage, she forced herself not to flinch. He washed his hands first, a detail that caught her attention. She realized he had done this often, perhaps as a soldier or ranch hand. "You've tended wounds before," she said, her voice more curious than defiant. He nodded once, focusing on the task. Plenty of times. He didn't elaborate, and she didn't press. The silence between them was not comfortable, but it was honest. She winced as he unwrapped the cloth. The wound was raw but clean, no sign of spreading infection. He packed it again with honey and tied it firm. Her mind, restless with pain and fear, pushed her to ask the question she had avoided the night before. "The men who attacked, do you think they'll come back?" Daniel's face hardened slightly. "Not tonight. They got what they came for. But raiders don't always think far ahead. Could be they circle back if they realize you're still breathing." The words unsettled her, though she had suspected as much. "And if they do, then we make it hard for them," he said simply. He did not boast, nor did he soften the truth. She studied him again. His manner suggested he had faced men like that before. But who was he, really? Why was he alone in this wilderness, sleeping in a cabin with shelves lined neatly, but no family photographs, no belongings beyond the essentials? She wanted to ask more, yet she stopped herself. Her upbringing had taught her never to show too much interest in those considered beneath her. Still, the curiosity gnawed. After tending the wound, Daniel stepped outside. Through the window, she saw him splitting kindling, his arms steady and practiced. The sound of the axe echoed off the trees, rhythmic, controlled. He hauled water from the barrel, checked the horse, then disappeared into the trees for nearly an hour. When he returned, he carried 2 rabbits, skinned them at the table, and dropped the meat into a pot. Catherine watched from the bunk. She felt both unsettled and oddly secure. The work of survival seemed second nature to him. To occupy herself, she began to tidy the cabin. She folded the extra blankets, stacked the tins neatly, and brushed dust from the shelf with a piece of cloth. It was a small act of control, but it made her feel less like a burden. When Daniel stepped inside and saw her effort, he paused. His expression didn't change much, but his voice carried quiet approval. "That'll help. Easier to find what we need." She blinked at him, surprised. She had expected him to dismiss her effort as pointless. Instead, he acknowledged it as useful. The simple respect caught her off guard. By evening, the stew was ready. Daniel served her first, then sat across the table with his own bowl. They ate in silence, the fire popping in the stove. Catherine found herself wondering what loss had carved the lines in his face, What grief kept him so measured and quiet? She wanted to ask, but the words stuck. Instead, she said something else. My father sent me west to marry a man I never chose. That was the reason I boarded that coach. The words came out sharper than she intended, half anger, half confession. Daniel lifted his eyes to her, steady calm. He didn't mock her, didn't pity her, didn't even ask for details. He just listened. That unsettled her more than judgment would have. When night fell, he laid his blanket at the door again, rifle at hand. She turned to the wall, but before she closed her eyes, she spoke quietly. Thank you. For today. It was a small word, heavy with reluctance, but genuine. Daniel gave a short nod, nothing more. Yet in that silence, something shifted. Catherine realized that for all her suspicion and pride, she trusted this man more tonight than she had the night before. She hated the thought, but it was true. As the wind moved through the trees outside, she wondered what price her father would have paid for such loyalty, and why it came so freely from a stranger who asked nothing in return. The storm rolled in before dawn. The first drops struck the roof with a hollow patter, and soon the cabin was wrapped in a steady roar of rain. Water pooled in the wash below, and the air turned damp and heavy. Catherine lay awake on the bunk, listening. She wondered how long she would be trapped in this one-room cabin with the man who had saved her. She had not asked him his name until now. She realized she should. When Daniel lit the lamp and moved to check her wound, she asked directly, "What do they call you?" He looked at her, his face as unreadable as ever. "Daniel," he said. Nothing more, as if the single word was all the explanation needed. She waited, hoping for another detail, but silence followed. He worked on her bandage with the same careful hands. The wound was healing, though it still throbbed when she shifted her weight. He replaced the cloth, poured out the dirty water, and returned to the stove. "My name is Catherine," she said finally, her tone clipped, rehearsed from years of introductions at formal dinners. But then, almost against her own habit, she added, "I was sent west to marry a man I do not know. My father believes he is respectable. I know only that he is wealthy and that he wanted me as part of his holdings." Her words surprised even herself. She had not planned to share that much, but the storm and the silence pressed the truth out of her. Daniel gave the faintest nod. He didn't look shocked, didn't look sympathetic. He let the information settle without judgment. She realized then that he was a man who listened more than he spoke, and that unnerved her more than outright questions would have. Later, while the rain still hammered the roof, she studied him as he sharpened a knife with slow, steady motions. The blade caught the lamplight. She thought of the raiders and the ease with which they had torn apart the stagecoach. The question escaped her before she could stop it. "Who did you bury?" Daniel's hand paused on the whetstone. For a moment, she thought he might ignore her. Then he spoke, voice low even. "My wife, my boy, both taken in the winter." He placed the knife down, his eyes fixed on the floor. After that, words seemed pointless. Catherine froze. She hadn't expected such honesty. She wanted to apologize, but the words would not come. Instead, she said softly, "I'm sorry." The silence between them grew heavier, but it wasn't empty anymore. It carried the weight of two lives altered by forces beyond their control. Catherine realized he carried grief that matched her own sense of betrayal, though of a different kind. For the first time since leaving the East, she did not feel completely alone in her loss. The storm raged for hours. Daniel worked on small repairs, the hinge of the door, the draft of the stove. Catherine, restless, picked up a torn sleeve from her trunk and sewed it back together. It was the first useful task she had done since the attack. She glanced up once and saw Daniel watching her hands. He gave a short nod, not patronizing, simply recognizing that she had her own ways of surviving. By evening, the rain eased to a steady drizzle. Daniel boiled beans and set 2 bowls on the table. They ate in silence, the quiet broken only by the occasional drip from the roof. Catherine felt the need to ask another question that had lingered since the attack. "If the raiders do return, do you have enough to keep them out?" He met her eyes across the table. "Enough. I've kept worse away." There was no boast in his tone, no attempt to frighten her. Just certainty. It both reassured and unsettled her. That night, when he laid his blanket by the door again, Catherine did not object. She turned on her side, watching the flicker of the dying lamp. She thought about her father's plan, about the fiancé she had never met. She thought about Daniel, who asked nothing of her, who carried grief without complaint, who treated her wound as if her survival mattered. As sleep pulled at her, she felt something she had not allowed herself in weeks, the faint beginning of trust. The rain had cleared by mid-morning, leaving the air sharp and cool. The ground outside the cabin steamed as the sun pushed through thinning clouds, and the forest smelled of wet pine and earth. Catherine managed to stand with Daniel's help and lean against the porch post. Her leg still burned, but she wanted to feel the air, to prove to herself she was not a prisoner inside those four log walls. She looked out across the draw, quiet and still, but she could not shake the memory of the raiders who had scattered her stagecoach. The question lingered in her mind. Would they return, or had fate spared her only for now? Daniel stood beside her, eyes scanning the tree line. He seemed restless, more alert than usual, and she realized he must be thinking the same thing. She wanted to ask him what he would do if the raiders came back, but she bit the question back. Instead, she asked something else that had been gnawing at her. "Why were you out here alone, that day you found me?" He didn't answer at once. His jaw shifted slightly, as if he measured whether she needed the truth. "I keep to myself. Work odd jobs. This cabin's on land I used to help run. I still come by, keep it standing." He paused, then added quietly, "It's easier than town." Catherine considered that. A man with no family, no home but a cabin in the hills. She thought of her own situation, sent west to be married into wealth she did not want, stripped of choice. Both of them had been forced into lives shaped by others, though in different ways. For the first time, she felt less like a lady stranded above her station, and more like another soul caught in circumstances beyond control. The conversation ended when Daniel suddenly stiffened, his eyes fixed on the ridge. Catherine followed his gaze and saw faint movement, small figures on horseback silhouetted against the horizon. Her breath caught. The raiders. Daniel's tone was calm but firm. "Inside. Now." She didn't argue. He guided her back to the bunk, then pulled the rifle from its pegs and set it by the window. He handed her the revolver from the shelf. "Do you know how to use it?" Catherine's pride wanted her to say yes, but honesty won. "I've fired one before. At a target. Not at a man. Point and squeeze," he said. "Don't waste bullets. Only if they're through the door." Her heart thudded as she gripped the heavy weapon. She watched him settle by the window, calm, steady, eyes following the riders. They drew closer, then slowed, their outlines clearer now. 5 men, rifles across their saddles. They stopped short of the draw, talking among themselves. One pointed toward the cabin. Another shook his head. Catherine's throat tightened. She wanted to ask Daniel what they were saying, what they were planning, but she stayed silent, afraid her voice would crack. Minutes dragged. Finally, the men turned their horses and rode off along the ridge. Daniel didn't relax right away. He stayed at the window until the last rider disappeared behind the trees. Only then did he lower the rifle. "They were weighing it," he said simply. "One rider's trail, one cabin, not much worth the fight. They'll find easier pickings." Catherine let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her hands trembled as she set the revolver back on the table. She hated the weakness, hated that he had seen it, but at the same time, she felt a wave of gratitude she could not voice. As Daniel put the rifle away, she studied him. He had not panicked, had not even raised his voice. He had read the men like a book, their hesitation, their decision to move on. He had known how to place her, how to prepare her without wasting words. That kind of certainty, she realized, came from hard experience. That night, after the fire in the stove had died to embers, she spoke into the dark. "If they had come, what would you have done?" His voice was quiet, almost flat. "The same as always. Keep them outside if I can. If not, make sure at least one of us walks away." She turned toward the wall, unsettled by the bluntness of his answer. Yet there was no bravado in it, no promise he couldn't keep. just the plain truth. For a long time, she lay awake, thinking of the life her father had planned for her, the security, the wealth, the walls of a grand ranch house. And she thought of this man, lying on the floor with nothing but his rifle and his grief, who had kept her alive without asking anything in return. When sleep finally came, it was heavy and dreamless. The question of where her life was truly headed still hung in the air, but for now she felt, against all reason, safer in a log cabin with Daniel than she had ever felt in the comfort of her father's home. The morning after the raiders passed, the world outside felt almost too calm. The air was fresh, the sky clear, and the only sound was the steady drip of water sliding from the pines. Catherine woke to find Daniel already moving about the cabin, boiling water, checking the rifle, his routine precise as always. For the first time since the attack on the stagecoach, she felt an odd sense of stability, like this man had drawn order out of chaos simply by refusing to waver. Her leg had begun to knit together. When Daniel inspected the wound, he grunted in quiet approval. "Healing clean," he said. "You'll walk soon." She wanted to tell him she already had, in the night, testing her balance by gripping the table when he wasn't looking. But instead, she only nodded. Pride still clung to her, but beneath it was something else now. Determination to prove she was more than a burden. She spent the morning tidying again, more deliberately this time. She asked Daniel where he kept certain supplies, forced herself to fetch water from the barrel with his help, and even tried standing at the stove. He didn't stop her, but he stayed near, his eyes following her every move in case she stumbled. She resented the watchfulness, but also found herself grateful for it. By midday, she managed to step out onto the porch. The sun was warm on her face, and for the first time since the raid, she felt like she could breathe. She asked Daniel how far the nearest town was. "Half a day on horseback," he said. "Longer if you're not steady." "And you plan to take me there?" she pressed. His eyes narrowed, measuring her tone. "If that's where you want to go." She hesitated. The thought of town meant decisions, contact with officials, perhaps even words sent to her fiancé. Her father's plan would catch up to her if she showed her face in public. Yet the idea of living hidden in a cabin with a man she barely knew unsettled her too. Both choices carried weight. "What do you think I should do?" she asked quietly. Daniel shook his head. "Not my place. You decide where you stand. I'll see you safe either way." His words struck her. He wasn't pushing, wasn't trying to claim her or bind her by debt. He was simply offering her freedom she had never been granted before. That, more than anything, left her unsettled. They rode out 2 days later when her strength had returned enough to manage the saddle. Daniel saddled his horse carefully, lifting her up with steady arms. She clenched her jaw at the closeness, but said nothing. The trail was rough, but beautiful, hills rolling with green, the air sharp with pine. Catherine found herself staring at the horizon, realizing how wide the West truly was. No ballroom, no parlor, no carriage had ever given her such a view. When they reached town, Catherine's heart pounded. The main street was busy, men carrying supplies, women hanging laundry, children running in the dust. The general store smelled of flour, leather, and tobacco. Daniel kept close as she moved between shelves, picking up thread, a plain dress, and a bar of soap. She noticed the stares, some curious, some suspicious. Whispers reached her ears. "Isn't that the lady from back east? The one promised to the rancher?" The words cut sharper than she expected. News had traveled farther than she imagined. She set her jaw and kept moving. At the counter, the deputy himself appeared, badge shining on his vest. He tipped his hat, respectful but cautious. "Miss, word's been out. Folks back east say you were taken in a raid. Your fiancé asked us to keep an eye out. Should I send him word you're safe?" Her breath caught. She thought of the man she had never met, the life her father had chosen, the cold halls of duty waiting. For a moment, she wavered, unsure if she had the strength to say what she truly wanted. Then she reached into her pocket, pulled out the ring her father had given her as a symbol of the arrangement, and set it on the counter. "No," she said firmly. "Tell him I survived, but tell him I will not be coming." The deputy studied her, then gave a slow nod. "As you wish, ma'am." He slid the ring into a pouch and wrote down her words carefully. He didn't argue. Perhaps he had seen enough of the West to know when a person had chosen their own path. Daniel stood silent beside her through it all. His face gave nothing away, but when they left the store and stepped back into the sun, Catherine felt something new. She had spoken her choice out loud, not to her father, not to her fiancé, but to herself. For the first time in her life, her future was no longer dictated by someone else's hand. On the ride back to the cabin, she glanced at Daniel. "I've made my decision," she said, her voice steady. "I won't be bound to a man I never chose. Whatever happens now, I'll face it on my own terms." Daniel gave the faintest nod. "Then we'll make a life from that." She looked out over the trail, the hills bathed in the gold of late afternoon. For the first time since the stagecoach raid, she didn't feel like a victim or a pawn. She felt like someone standing at the edge of a new beginning, frightened, yes, but free. The trail back to the cabin was quiet except for the steady rhythm of hooves and the creak of leather. Catherine sat tall in the saddle now, her back straighter than when Daniel had first carried her through the dust. She felt the ache in her leg, but bore it without complaint. The decision she had made in town, handing back the ring, refusing the marriage, had cleared something inside her. For the first time since leaving the East, she felt her life belonged to her. Daniel kept his horse at a measured pace beside her. He didn't ask questions, didn't press her about what came next. His silence wasn't indifference, it was respect. He had lived long enough to know that some choices should stand without commentary. Catherine noticed that, and though she said nothing, she felt gratitude settle deep in her chest. Back at the cabin, life resumed with a new rhythm. Daniel repaired the roof shingles before autumn rains could come. Catherine, no longer confined to the bunk, moved with purpose. She organized supplies, washed linens, learned how to chop kindling despite the strain on her leg. When she fumbled, Daniel corrected her quietly, showing her how to hold the axe or brace her weight without losing balance. He didn't take over her tasks, didn't treat her as fragile. He let her learn, and she respected him for that more than she could say. The days grew shorter. Together, they planted late beans in the soil near the creek, hoping to have something green before frost. Catherine found herself kneeling in the dirt, her dress hem stained, her hands rougher than they had ever been. It should have embarrassed her, but instead it filled her with an unexpected sense of pride. She had never worked for her own survival before, and now she did so with a man who asked nothing but her presence at his side. One morning, Daniel saddled the horse and told her they had a place to visit. He didn't explain, just handed her the reins. They rode up a ridge she had not yet seen, the trail winding through tall firs. At the top, the land opened into a clearing with a wide view of the valley below. Daniel dismounted and walked to a spot marked by a small wooden cross driven into the ground. Catherine followed, her steps quiet, respectful. He stood there for a long moment, hat in his hands. His voice was low when he finally spoke. "This is where I laid them. My wife, my boy. I come here when I need to remember." Catherine felt her throat tighten. She had wondered about the grief in his eyes, the silence he carried. Now she saw the truth of it before her. She knelt beside the cross, brushed away a scatter of pine needles, and whispered, "They're not forgotten." She didn't look at Daniel when she said it, but she felt the weight of his silence shift. It was not lighter, not yet, but it was shared. On the ride back, the air between them was different. Not warmer, not easier, but steadier. Catherine realized she had been waiting for him to demand something, to expect payment for her survival. But he never did. What he offered was presence, labor, and honesty. And she understood now that it was enough. Winter came early. Snow dusted the roof, and the stove burned day and night. The cabin, once a place of survival, became a home of sorts. Catherine mended clothes by lamplight while Daniel cut wood or checked traps. They spoke little, but when they did, it was plain and real, about food, about the weather, about what work needed to be done. The silences between them no longer felt strained. They felt earned. One evening, after a long day of work, Catherine sat by the stove, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. Daniel came in from the cold, stamping snow from his boots. He looked at her for a long moment, then said, "You've stayed longer than you had to." She held his gaze steady, calm. "I chose to." He nodded, as if that settled it. And in truth, it did. They needed no further promises, no declarations. The choice was clear, shared between them. By spring, the beans sprouted green through the thawed soil. The creek ran fast with meltwater, and the hills brightened with color. Catherine stood on the porch beside Daniel, watching the valley stretch wide before them. She reached for his hand, hesitant at first, then certain. He took it without a word. There were no debts between them now, no unfinished questions. She was no longer the wounded noblewoman furious at his touch, and he was no longer the quiet stranger bound only by duty. They were two people who had survived, who had chosen to stay, and in that choice they had found something stronger than what either had been given before. The story ended there, two lives set side by side, building something new from the hard ground of the West, steady in the knowledge that they would not walk away.